Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Good evening. My name is Kathleen Lima. I'm the Awareness Week co-chair for the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, also known as HTPP. Let's see. The Human Trafficking Prevention Project formed around 5 years ago when students and like-minded faculty came together to form this club to train local hotels for signs of human trafficking. These trainings evolved into the Human Trafficking Prevention Project you see on display here tonight. The 4 pillars of our organization are training, client representation, legislative advocacy, and awareness events. We still do trainings, of course, but in addition to hotels, we now also train schools, hospitals, the general public, pretty much anyone who will listen to us. Through our civil justice clinic, we provide direct legal support to those who have been trafficked. And we have been working on legislation. We just actually had a wonderful legislation passed to help trafficking survivors and people who have been trafficked. And finally, we do things such as this wonderful event that we are so excited that you are here to watch and to listen and learn. So if you are interested and would like to attend our other panels, I'm gonna post a flyer in the chat, and I would just love to highlight some of our other Zoom events that we're going to be doing. So we have 2 new other Zoom events, one happening on Wednesday and one happening on Friday. The Wednesday event, we are hosting an online webinar titled Labor Trafficking at Home, Involuntary Domestic Servitude in the US. This will be featuring survivors and advocates. On Friday, we'll be hosting our classic training that we do for hotels, hospitals, and so many more that I already talked about. We welcome you all to attend as many events as you can. Finally, if you're here for CLE credit or a Quinnipiac Law student here for the raffle, please pay attention to the 2 codes that will be administered in the chat at random times throughout this presentation. Now I will hand this torch over to Sheila, and I just wanted to once again thank the Connecticut Bar Foundation, the Connecticut Bar Association, and all of our panelists. Thank you so much. Take it away, Sheila.
Thank you. Yes, and I want to thank everyone who made this possible. As you may know, this is part of our Understanding Human Trafficking series, which actually came out of Human Trafficking Awareness Week. So the students have been doing this at Quinnipiac for 4 years now, and we did a little hiatus through Zoom, moved into this Human Trafficking series, which has also happened on Zoom, and now we're sort of taking off with both of those ideas. So again, just wanted to highlight what Kathleen said. Please tune in for our other events this week. Especially, I wanted to highlight the Wednesday panel where we have some folks with lived experience, survivors of labor trafficking, specifically domestic servitude, some of whom are also advocates. And we also have 2 lawyers joining who will give us a little legal lens onto what these survivors and activists are sharing with us, their stories. But the focus is on their lived experiences and their stories and what happened to them here in the United States as victims of labor trafficking. And I also wanted to just let you know that if you are wanting to refresh your memory as to the bios of our wonderful panelists, they are on our website, and I'm going to ask Kathleen to put that in the chat. One of us can do that. There are also some great materials, like there's so much reading to do. I think your minds will be spinning once you hear these women talk. They're just incredible. But they have given us some materials that we would encourage you to take a look at. And I also just wanted to point out that we have a Q&A box. There's no public chat, but we encourage you to come up with questions and post them there, and we'll do our best to try to answer as many of those as possible. We have 6 to 8 as our time frame, but we're hoping that by around 7:10, we'll start taking questions from the audience, which hopefully will be exciting. And I just wanted to just say how excited I am that we were able to make this happen. We couldn't have done this without Erin, frankly, with all 3 of you. It was really a team effort. But what was so fascinating for me when the students and I started doing these human trafficking trainings, people said, never at your human trafficking training talk about prostitution, because or the difference between human trafficking and prostitution, because that will get you down a path of debate that will never end, and you'll never be able to get back onto the topic of trafficking. And so we listened and we understood quickly how that was actually very true. And I hope that's a topic that will absolutely come up today, and we'll be able to explore what are the contours of human trafficking versus prostitution, and what are the different views about that. But eventually we came across folks who were actually trafficking victims. And I have a client right now who has a prostitution charge, and she is a trafficking victim. And I cannot tell you how difficult it has been for us to just get that dismissed, even with a letter from DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, basically stating that she has been participating in a trafficking prosecution as a victim. And we're still having trouble getting rid of that. So that sort of started opening our eyes to the criminal convictions that folks all along the spectrum face, and what more can we do? And with that, I think finally Erin said to me, Sheila, you still don't want to have this debate. It gets very contentious and it's a very tough debate to have, and you have to enter it carefully. And finally, somehow you were convinced. I think it's because increasingly states across the country are looking at legislation, and we thought we really do need to sort of have this conversation, even if we don't have any solid answers, so that people are a little more informed about how challenging, complex, and important these questions are for the state of Connecticut and the country. So with no further ado, I just wanted to open it up to Erin, but I wanted to say one final thing about our folks here. It has been just a complete privilege. Kate came last year to speak 2 years ago at Human Trafficking Awareness Week to speak on some of these issues. So I'm like thrilled to welcome you back with your range of experiences all across the map. And Mary, we just started working with this year because she works out of Boston, but just has been like a true light in terms of these kinds of issues. And really all three of you sort of know this issue inside and out. So thank you for being here. I hope we can model a civil conversation for our students and for the nation. And I'll pass it on to you now, Erin. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Sheila. So yeah, I think before we get started, why don't we just introduce ourselves briefly so you know who we are and kind of where we're from. My name is Erin Williamson. I work for an anti-trafficking organization called Love 146. We're an international organization, but we're based here in New Haven, Connecticut. Hence why I know Sheila so well, who is at Quinnipiac University here in Connecticut. So Mary, do you want to introduce yourself, and then Kate will introduce you, and then we can kind of get started?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Spetta, and I serve as the Chief Impact Officer at Amira. We provide exit and aftercare services for women coming out of the sex trade. As my personal background, I am a researcher, a policy analyst, and a survivor of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. My research primarily exists in the area of exiting from the commercial sex trade.
Hi, good evening. I'm Kate Diadamo. I'm with Reframe Health and Justice. We're a consulting collective of queer and trans people of color that work at the intersections of harm reduction, criminal legal reform, and healing justice. And my background is working predominantly with folks in the sex trade, originally as a community organizer, and as well as with service providers that provide services for trafficking victims. And now I get to work with community organizers and advocates with that background around the country who are looking to engage in the political process.
Awesome. So I'm going to give kind of a little contextual background, just because I think people who are attending this are coming from a wide range of backgrounds. We have law students. We also have people in the anti-trafficking field who may be more versed in things. And so just one of the things that's kind of amazing about the anti-trafficking movement is it does bring everybody together, right? We have people from all walks of life who really do want to address this issue, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of, faith, belief, background. And in general, there's a lot of agreement in the anti-trafficking movement, right? There's this agreement that there should be the elimination of exploitation of our fellow human beings, right? There's an agreement that underlying vulnerabilities like poverty and discrimination and housing insecurity lead a lot of people to be vulnerable for trafficking, and that those things must be addressed if we're going to have a comprehensive view of trafficking and really address it from prevention all the way through intervention. And this focus tonight is really going to focus on adults because there is generally widespread agreement that children cannot consent to commercial sex, and that if you're under the age of 18, that you are a victim of trafficking if there is any kind of commercial exchange for any sort of sexual act. So for those of you who are newer to the field, there are areas of disagreement within our field, right? And one of the primary areas of disagreement are what policies are going to be most effective in helping us achieve that goal? So what are the most effective policies we can put in place to at least end or get the largest group of people to reduce exploitation of our fellow human beings? And a lot of attention within the movement has historically been pointed to, as Sheila noted, to this division regarding what do we do about the intersection of sex work and human trafficking. And for those of you who are not familiar with the anti-trafficking movement, this has caused some pretty significant divides in our field. And some may call it camps, right, in our field. And so part of the goal tonight is to just kind of engage in discourse, as Sheila said, civil discourse around this issue, and also to recognize where we can come together, where there is unity, where we do have a shared vision of a world in which there isn't exploitation and there isn't trafficking of human beings. So there's general agreement, and I'm going to show you in a minute kind of a spectrum of legal services, but there's general agreement that full criminalization, which is what the United States has right now, where it is illegal to both sell sex and purchase sex, that isn't working, right? We are still seeing a lot of exploitation take place. We are still seeing a lot of trafficking take place. And so really the question is, what should replace that, right? And that's kind of where we're going to start with tonight. And so I'm going to share a screen with you. This is not the end all be all of explaining this situation. But again, I want to make sure we're all starting from some shared understanding. And so if you look at this screen right over and full criminalization, that is what we have. It's illegal to sell sex, to buy sex, organizing sex work is illegal. Trafficking is illegal, and services are primarily focused on trafficking survivors. And this is, some examples are not just us, but South Africa, Russia, all have kind of this full criminalization. Then we have partial decriminalization. And what I'm going to say is, even though there's 4 categories, it's not just separate categories that are very clearly defined. It's really a spectrum that exists. So partial decriminalization might also be referred to as the Nordic model, the equity model, asymmetrical criminalization. And this, when we're talking about this, we're talking about the decriminalization of selling sex, but still keeping the buying of sex illegal. Organizing for sex work remains illegal. Trafficking remains illegal. And here, when we get to services, we're looking at services being provided for people who want to exit the sex industry and or harm reduction services. And really, the services under this kind of framework really depend on how legislation is written and how the policy is passed. Some examples are Sweden, Canada, Israel. Full decriminalization, that is the decriminalization of both the selling and the purchasing of sex, also decriminalization of organizing around that. Under all of these, including full decriminalization, it is still illegal to traffic somebody. And in terms of government regulation, there's minimal regulation. So full decriminalization is really about taking the laws that exist off the book, not putting a lot of regulation into the laws. And really, services under this kind of model are exit services and harm reduction. And then finally, we have what we call full legalization. Again, legal to sell sex, legal to buy sex, legal to organize, but really that's specific to some forms. Usually it's brothels. Again, still illegal to traffic. So under all of these, trafficking remains illegal. And in terms of government regulation, there's a lot more government regulation in this model. It's specific to industry. Usually it's around the geography of where this will take place. And sellers oftentimes have to register. And here, again, the services can be for exit services and or harm reduction, again, depending on the policy. And some examples are Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. So again, that gives us kind of a framework for what we can think of when we're talking about this issue. But again, I really want to emphasize it is a spectrum, right? It is not just these 4 categories. At Love 146, we don't take a position on what we should do to replace what is now full criminalization. And part of that is because we work with children, right? And as we said before, there's widespread agreement that when it comes to children, children cannot consent to commercial sex. And so one of the things that has allowed us to do as an organization is really set a wide table. So we go to a lot of conferences. We talk to a lot of people. We talk to people who have a lot of perspectives around this. And one of the things that has really become clear to us is how much agreement there actually is in the field, and how much misperceptions or perceptions based on things that have happened in the past continues to exist. And so really part of our goal is to open up dialogue, right? That's one of the goals. So the goal of today's panel is to engage in discussion. It's not a debate. Really to help the people who are listening recognize what are the different perspectives, and also where is there widespread agreement? Where can we move forward collectively as a movement to address trafficking? Again, we want to really come together and learn from each other. This is a complex issue. People are coming, including our panelists, but also everyone in attendance. We're all coming to this topic with our own histories, right? That might be how we grew up, our life experiences, our experiences in the anti-trafficking movement or in other movements. This all shapes how we view this issue. And so one of the things that I want to encourage people to do is, no matter how you're coming to this conversation today, ask yourself, what would it take for me to think a little bit differently about this? What would I need to hear to open up my mind and to recognize that there might be multiple perspectives, not just an either or, not just a black and white, but a really complex narrative around this issue that deserves a lot more attention, but also shouldn't just separate us and not allow us to come together around so many other things where there is widespread agreement. So I do want to kind of add a disclaimer that while we have Kate and Mary, and they are amazing, and you're going to learn so much, and they're so awesome, they are by no means here to represent their camps, right? They are not speaking for everybody who shares their perspective. So please don't put that on them. Don't expect that of them. We're not expecting that of them. I don't expect that of them. And so they're just here to share where they've come in terms of this conversation and dialogue, and to engage with each other and kind of really just show the field about how we can maybe begin to have some of these conversations and really kind of come together in a civilized manner around this, and again, a lot of other issues. So again, the goal is dialogue. It's to grow. It's to have people listen and engage with the issue. And honestly, maybe some people are going to shift where they are on that spectrum during this conversation, and that's okay, right? We give full permission for that to happen in either direction. So with that said, I'm going to start with you, Mary, and can you give us a little background on why is there general agreement in the field that what we currently have, which is full criminalization, why is that not working for us to get to a point where we have eliminated or drastically reduced trafficking and exploitation?
Yeah, of course. I'm so grateful that we can have this conversation, and grateful to Kate and Aaron, to both of you for that we're doing this. When we got together before setting this up, Kate and I sort of had a discussion, and we both agree that criminalization is not working. And there are multiple reasons for that. The greatest reason is that criminalization, full criminalization of the sex trade, does not reflect the realities of what the sex trade is. This is actually a rather antiquated policy. There is enough research now to show the realities of the sex trade, particularly some major studies that we can generalize that showed that 87 to 89% of people in the sex trade are not there by choice. They're either trafficked there, or they are there out of a need for economic survival, whether that is an addiction, or they're facing housing insecurity, or whatever that is. And there are a group of people in the sex trade who are there by choice, but across the spectrum, these three groups of people are being criminalized, and many of them are being criminalized simply for surviving. In addition to that, it limits our ability to interact with people in the sex trade because everyone is perceived as a criminal. So that limits government funding to specifically people who have a trafficking background. And that limits our ability to design harm reduction services for everyone who trades sex, regardless of choice. And so, people who are in the sex trade, they experience the range of violence that is in the sex trade. The majority of people experience rape, assault, battery, all sorts of different forms of violence, often at the hands of sex buyers. And there's not a proper form of retaliation. There's not a proper form of justice for those individuals, because when law enforcement gets involved, it perceives the entire situation as criminal. And the person who is trading sex, or the person being sold for sex, is penalized more than buyers are. And there's research that backs that up. And when we look at law enforcement is not trained across the spectrum to identify trafficking. Oftentimes, trafficking victims are arrested and they have prostitution records. To what Sheila was saying earlier with her client, that then it's practically impossible to get those records expunged or vacated. And it affects individuals for the rest of their lives, with every single aspect of their lives. So when we look at the impact of full criminalization is causing a whole lot more harm than it is protection or good to the people in the sex trade, and really to our society.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And Kate, I'm going to turn to you, because on the other side of kind of that spectrum that we showed, there's legalization, which is not a stance that kind of either of you have taken, and not a stance that most people in the field take. So most people in the field, in the anti-trafficking field, recognize, full criminalization is not working, right? And something has to shift. And also, on the flip side, most people in the field are not advocating for what is called legalization, what we're calling. So can you explain a little bit about why that is?
Sure. And I think part of the challenge is that legalization, people think, there's decrim, which means no laws. There's criminalization, which means all the laws. And then there's legalization. And that's really not what legalization is. Legalization was kind of a moment in time. And that's when a lot of these laws were passed. And when we're talking about legalization, what we're really looking at is a pretty onerous government structure that is incredibly unique to the sex industry, and presents really significant barriers to folks participating. And a lot of those barriers are also very heavy on management. They give a lot of power to management and not necessarily on workers. So when we're looking at legalization, it was a period of time where that was the trend that was happening, especially in the EU and in a few other places in the world. And so what we saw were things like the development of red light districts. We saw you can work, but you can only work in a brothel, which is what Nevada has, but you cannot work independently. You have to register, which a number of different places have. And in some of those places, those are publicly discoverable registries. There's incredibly high barriers in terms of licensing fees. And what these things serve to do is to really, like I said, put a lot of control in the hands of management. But additionally, it really serves to re-marginalize the most marginalized people who are accessing the sex industry. And so when you have things like, you have to be on a publicly discoverable licensing database that is controlled by the state. It's several $100s. You can get a license, but you can only work in this one place. If you work independently, you're going to be arrested again. If you are a migrant, you're going to be arrested again and probably deported. When we're talking about legalization, we're talking about what tends to be very, very onerous, high barrier entry to the sex industry. And we already know what happens. We know that people who are facing economic insecurity, people who are much more economically precarious, migrants, like I said, those people are not able to legally participate in the sex industry and end up recriminalized. And for those who do work legally in the sex industry, it's still a very management-centered and management-controlled industry, and not the kind of, a situation that we would consider to have the most access to harm reduction, the most access to autonomy, and the most access to independence, which is what we're looking to when we think about trying to end exploitation.
So today we're going to kind of focus in the middle of that spectrum, right? On partial decriminalization, full decriminalization, the equity model, Nordic model. Again, there is a spectrum of this, and so I just want to emphasize this is very complex. You might hear people talk about this in the field as a black or white issue. It's either this or that, but it is a spectrum of things. And so I would love to hear from each of you. Mary, maybe we can start with you. Given kind of your background and everything you've done in the field, what model do you think is best for replacing full criminalization, which we currently have? And how do you think that model gets us closer towards, again, what is our shared goal, our shared common goal of ending exploitation of fellow human beings?
Yeah, so I am not a lawyer, but I'm a policy person. And so the way that when I talk about this, I try to talk about the difference between law and policy. And laws, like the individual laws that we look at and that we write, that's like the tree, right? The policy is the forest. And the policy is those collection of laws and how we want to shape the forest. So as far as the policy perspective that I support, it would be the equality model, which partial decriminalization is a key characteristic of the equality model. But a full-fledged policy around partial decriminalization is required for the implementation of that to actually be successful. So what do I mean by that? When we partially decriminalize the sex trade, research has shown that like of those 4 big buckets, and like Erin said, it's really a spectrum. If you think about this as like colors, there's a lot of different colors in between. When we look at legalization, the London School of Economics showed that in countries where the sex trade was legalized, there was a massive spike in sex trafficking. It has the highest rates of sex trafficking of the 4 models. When we get closer to partial decriminalization, there's a decline in sex trafficking in those countries where those policies have been actually implemented. Partial decriminalization also, the criminalization of demand is that key characteristic. That is the big difference between a full-formed equality model policy and a full decriminalization policy. And that criminalization of demand, it does 3 things. The first thing is that it keeps the economic stability of the sex trade. When we decriminalize demand, the sex trade follows the basic laws of economics. So demand goes up, and when demand goes up, price goes down. So individuals who are in the sex trade are in a rough economic position because they are now not able to earn the same amount of money that they were before demand was, when demand was criminalized, which also puts them at greater risk. You have to see more buyers, and the more buyers that you see, the greater risk you are for experiencing violence and therefore experiencing harm. So people tend to make less money in those other 3 models. There's also an increase, like I said, in sex trafficking in other models. And there's an increase in violence within the sex trade because when we decriminalize demand, it invites more people to participate in the sex trade as buyers, which we see higher levels of violence in those situations. So those are the really sort of defining characteristics of that partial decriminalization. But a fully formed equality model policy that I think is necessary also requires exit and aftercare and harm reduction services to everyone who is trading sex in the sex trade, regardless of choice, regardless of whether or not they have a trafficker. Everyone experiences the same trauma, the same violence that everyone else does when sex is traded in that space. And not everyone has the economic choice to leave it. The sex trade is deeply linked to systemic racism. It is deeply linked to vulnerability, to poverty, to housing insecurity. And so a fully formed equality model policy links to all of those other policies that we have. It links to healthcare, it links to housing, it links to education, it links to poverty reduction. So that's the policy approach that I'm in support of.
Great. That was a great overview of that. And so, Kate, do you mind kind of doing the same thing, right? What is the policy approach that, from your perspective, you think is going to get us, as close as possible to eliminating the exploitation of our fellow human beings?
Sure. So I believe in decriminalization of the sex trade, and that I'm going to not talk about legalization since we already talked about that and no one's really here for it. But so when we're looking at criminalization, we know the impact of that. When we look at asymmetrical criminalization, we know we can see kind of the impact of that. And when we look at decriminalization, there are some countries that we can look to say, all right, when a country moved from one policy to another, what happened? And so the first country to really change its legal regime in a really significant way, under one of those ways, was in 1999 specifically with Sweden. Since then, 7 other countries have changed to asymmetrical criminalization, and 1 country has fully moved to decriminalization, which is New Zealand. And so we can look at what happened before and after in a lot of those countries, and it's really telling. When we look at countries that moved, I know we've talked about size of the industry. When New Zealand decriminalized, the size of the industry stayed pretty similar, and it slightly contracted a little bit. When we look at other countries, movement to asymmetrical criminalization also didn't really shift the size of the market. And so we're really looking at the same number of people. What did change? And what I always really focus on is policing of the sex industry. What happened with law enforcement when we changed this criminal regime? And so under decriminalization, obviously, that is a removal not just of criminal penalties, but also of policing and surveillance of the sex industry. And that is the thing that really determines a lot of factors around health and safety for people that trade sex. So we know that people in the sex trade, everyone kind of makes decisions about what they're going to do for harm reduction. How are you going to keep yourself safe? And we know that decision is impacted by criminalization, but it's impacted by policing first, because people are making decisions when they're trading sex about how to avoid arrest. And avoiding arrest very often means taking on risk with clients because you want to be sure that you're not with a cop. So you have to make certain decisions. You have to make decisions to avoid, let's say you're working on a stroll. If you know that there's a police patrol that's going around once every hour, you're going to be hyper aware of that. And maybe you'll leave a place where you know that there's a patrol to go to another place where you're less comfortable. Because at the end of the day, you still have to see that client. You still have that economic need, but your decision is, I have to meet this economic need without getting arrested. We know that when we switched to asymmetrical criminalization, in a lot of places that meant that policing of the sex industry went through the roof, and it really ended up targeting the most marginalized in the sex industry. And so what happened was people were saying, I have to take on additional risks to make my client feel comfortable because they're avoiding policing too now. And so what people were doing was going into more isolated locations to try to meet clients. They were working with clients who were less likely to give them the information to stay safe. They had more clients who were saying, come to my house because I feel comfortable here. I don't feel comfortable going to where you usually work out of. And so the impact of a lot of that was that people started taking on additional risk for physical and sexual violence because that was what was safer than them getting arrested or their clients getting arrested or them not meeting clients and not making that money. So what happens when we increase or when we have these kind of changes is not that the size of the sex industry changes, we know that what changes is the power dynamics between the two people who are involved, because they're both avoiding police. So we know that rates of violence went up. We know that things like condom negotiations stopped, because if your client is afraid to talk about condoms because they're afraid they're with a cop, you have to wait to do that until you're in a secluded location. You have to not talk about it at all. You have to give that up. We also know that clients who were afraid of policing, who are probably going to be the safer clients, the clients less likely to cause harm, those are the ones who stopped buying sex. And that meant that people had a fewer number of clients to choose from. They couldn't say no to clients. We also know that if you can't refuse clients, you're more likely to drop your prices. You're more likely to provide services that you wouldn't otherwise. And so people stopped saying no to clients they didn't want to see. And so the result of this is that across the board, with 7 countries where there was actually research done on what happened to people who were trading sex under these models, we know that violence went up. And it went up, it fully doubled within a year in Ireland when they passed those models. We know that people said that their conditions of work declined. They felt less likely that they were going to refuse clients. They also said that they were more reliant on third parties, on managers who were able to get them clients. We know that people's economic insecurity fell through, that housing instability went up. We know that in every single country where we've looked, what happens to sex workers under asymmetrical criminalization is that lives get worse and violence goes up. And those are all the predictors of trafficking. And across the board, none of those countries have been able to actually report a reduction in exploitation. And so when we're looking at what models have done the best, we can look to New Zealand, where people said they were more likely to refuse clients after decriminalization. They were more likely to leave exploitative management situations and change that situation under decriminalization. We also know that trafficking did not go up in New Zealand. The size of the market did not change significantly. And the thing about decriminalization that's really important, and I think speaks to me as an organizer, is that decriminalization movements are led by people who are living under these laws. And I know we're going to talk about, there's criminalization, and then there's also services, and those are not the same thing, and they're not intrinsically intertwined. And so I believe in a policy of removing criminal penalties for adults consensually engaging in the sex industry, focusing on violence, focusing on exploitation under criminal law, as well as a suite of services for people before they get into the sex industry, robust services while they're in the sex industry, and robust services when they want to leave the sex industry.
Great. So I am going to just pull back up the chart for 1 second, because again, I know we are coming at this with varying kind of understandings and backgrounds. And I just want to make sure we're all centered. So we've talked about, full criminalization, which is what we have right now. There's general agreement that that's not working. We've kind of shared a little bit about why there's agreement that legalization is not the way to go. Mary's perspective is, she's really supportive of what's currently under partial decriminalization. Specifically, it's the equity model. And that would decriminalize the selling. So you'd be able to sell sex. You still would not be able to buy sex or organize around that. And what Kate's saying is that she believes that the model that's going to get us closer to our goals is full decriminalization, which is decriminalizing both the selling and the purchasing of sex. I just so you know, I posted that in the chat. So anyone should feel free to pick it up and open it while we're having this discussion. One of the things that I am always aware of is that when we have these conversations, right, the only data that we have is from other countries, right? So it's really hard, right? It's really hard for us to say, this is for sure what's going to happen if we pass this type of policy, or this is for sure what's going to happen because it's a different country. They have different laws around other things. They have different social safety nets or services. They have different interactions with law enforcement, to Kate's point, and to that point. One of the things that I know people are really cognizant of, and I think actually both of you have spoken to this, is that a lot of people who end up either being trafficked or in the sex industry, right? They're there because they have economic needs, or they're there if they're being trafficked because they're being exploited. And so and we also know that buyers, right, people who purchase sex, some of them are fine, and you negotiate and they do exactly what they say that they're going to negotiate. But there's also violence among some buyers, right? And that can be physical violence, that can be verbal violence. And so I am wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how the model that you're thinking is going to kind of move us more towards that. And how would they deal with these buyers who engage in violence, right? Where they engage in verbal violence or sexual violence, where where whatever is negotiated, they kind of cross over that line. It can be rape, it can be sexual assault. I don't know who wants to go first. We've been starting with Mary. I don't know, Kate, if you want to start, or Mary, do you want to start, Kate, and then we'll switch to Mary and shake it up a little bit?
Sure. So under all of these models, violence against sex workers is criminalized. And so, when we're talking about this, violence is not decriminalized under any of these. And so what we're talking about is, when that happens, or I think we should be talking about when that happens, is what are the barriers to finding justice, and what are the barriers for people seeking support for that? And so under all of these models, what is still constituted as exploitation, what is still physical violence, would still be there. And hopefully under other models, or under both equity and decriminalization, hopefully there would be some outreach to kind of try to address that. I would say the only place, or the place where that is hardest, is under criminalization. In over a decade of community organizing, I've dealt with so many situations of violence, and there's not a single one of them where someone wanted to report to law enforcement. Most people did not. And of the ones where people did, the first step across the board was always trying to figure out how they were not going to get arrested. And that is simply a barrier that we need to dismantle immediately. I would say that, that is something that is, I think, a really important part of this conversation. When someone interacts with, is victimized, but they are used to interacting and they are only seen by a criminal legal system as someone who is a criminal, you're not necessarily going to get the best results when people do experience violence.
All right, Mary, now you're up. How can you talk a little bit about partial decrim and how violent buyers would be addressed under that system?
Yeah, so when we look at the sex trade in the US and what policy would do to sex trade in the US, like you said, we do have data from other countries, but we do have a lot of data on the sex trade itself in the United States, which we need to use to contextualize what a policy adaptation would do. And multiple studies have been conducted on individuals in the sex trade, regardless of whether or not they were trafficked, that showed that the majority experienced some form of violence, whether that was beating, being shot, being stabbed, being assaulted, the range of things. We also know that people who sell sex and people who are sold for sex are the #1 target for serial killers. So there's a massive amount of violence in the sex trade that we have to acknowledge is there, and it's not going away. One of the reasons why the nickname for this policy is the equality model is because in the US, with our current structure under full criminalization, it's not an equitable situation. A study in the Midwest showed that 1 out of 10 arrests related to the sex trade are of buyers, and 9 out of 10 arrests related to the sex trade are of people who are sold for sex. So there is not equitability in the way that criminalization is applied to these two groups of people. When we shift to a partial decriminalization model, that shifts the power dynamics to create more equality. That gives people who are sold for sex the ability to report violence with impunity. knowing that that violence is actually going to be taken seriously. And the focus is not going to shift to them as the person who's being sold for sex to be arrested under prostitution charges or whatever that may be. The continued criminalization of demand also gives prosecutors the ability to continue to identify trafficking. Because by targeting demand, we're able to look at where is the sex trade most prevalent? What does that activity look at? We develop trusting relationships with the people in the sex trade. And as that information slowly comes out about whether or not they were trafficked, then we can actually start to do something about trafficking. The Swedish ambassador was in Boston a couple of years ago for a conference, and he shared that there was a case in which the police were called 5 times to a residence by the same woman reporting violence from buyers. And every time they would show up, every time they would take care of the buyer, every time they would ask her, are you here of your own accord? Are you okay? Are you all set to go? Every single time she said, yes, I'm here of my own accord, I'm fine. The 5th time they came and she reported that violence, she said, actually, I'm being trafficked. Can you help me get out? So we're able to target violence on both sides. We're able to target violence of the buyer, and we're able to create those trusting relationships that then target the trafficker. And when we look at the way that buyers interact with people who are sold in the sex trade, the demand abolition study that was conducted a few years ago really showed that there's a dehumanization of people who are sold for sex on behalf of the buyer, on behalf of whether or not they like what they're doing, what they are there to do, the buyer, requesting all sorts of things and assuming that they should accommodate all of their requests because they're being paid. That dehumanization really escalates in a full criminalization situation.
That's super helpful. So we've talked about buyers, right? That's a major difference, right? In terms of the various models. The other thing that Kate has mentioned especially is the intersection between criminalization and services. And so I know that we've talked a lot about how important services are, right? I think, again, another area where we agree. There should be services, and there's not enough services, and anybody who wants services should be able to access those services. But we sometimes know policy does not always pass changes to criminal law along with service provision, or if they do pass it, they don't always fund it. And so I'm curious, kind of, as we look at each of these models, and if you could each speak to it, how important is it that those two are or are not, or does it not matter how closely they are paired when we're looking at implementation of this model? Again, let's do Kate. Do you want to talk first, and then Mary, and then we'll switch it back up again?
Sure. Yeah, criminalization and services, I shouldn't be related, frankly. No one should have to get arrested before they get access to services. No one should have to deal with the trauma of arrest before they are allowed. And when we say services, we mean incredibly basic things. When we're talking about, we're not talking about incredibly robust, long-term support for people. We're talking about survival, and no one should have to, face arrest, criminalization, that whole process to get access to services. And so when we're talking about the nexus of the two, that is something that is absolutely assumed. I think there's this incredibly flawed idea that people need to be arrested before they want services, before they want support. And that is, it's frankly not true. No one needs an open case to be convinced that what they need is stable housing. And so we should be able to create incredibly robust services that do not require that. And, and that's true when we look at even what we consider victim services, when we look at, what is also incredibly underfunded, incredibly paltry when it comes to support for people who have survived harm. That shouldn't have to happen either. It is kind of sociopathic that we require people to be hurt and harmed and reach a very significant level of victimization before we think that they deserve really basic things, before we think, all right, now you can expunge the record that has been keeping you out of living wage jobs. All right, now we're able to give you support to go to school. We shouldn't require people to be hurt and traumatized before they get access to things that are survival needs. And so I think when we're talking about the relationship between the two, what we're talking about is a political conversation and not a lived reality conversation, but a political conversation that's happening at the expense of people's lived reality. Because so often, you can't move forward one without the other. If we're looking even federally right now, they've passed 15 billion in support for Health and Human Services at the same time that they've approved $735 billion for the Department of Defense. And these are political calculations that are being made. They're really causing people to have to face incredible levels of hurt before they're able to access anything at all. I think where we also need to talk about is the impact of policing. From my experience, I've been a community organizer for a very long time of people who are engaged in sex work across the spectrum. Sex work is not inherently dangerous and violent. Sex workers are put at risk because of the way that we treat sex workers. And so when we're talking about the relationship between these two things, we have to talk about the impact of criminalization and policing and how that is hurting people, how that is not only impeding access to health and wellness, but impeding access to services, impeding access to harm reduction, and how criminalization is actually hindering our efforts to allow people to access support. When I was in New York, one of the very first campaigns that I ever worked on was about the fact that police were confiscating people's condoms, using that as enough for an arrest and a charge for prostitution, and sometimes just taking people's condoms and telling them to go work without them. And so what we knew was the relationship between criminalization and services was also a conversation between criminalization and health and wellness. And we knew that criminalization and policing was putting people at risk. So not only was it creating these barriers, not only were police saying that they were the only way for people to get access to basic things, what we knew was that the simple act of policing of the sex trade was actually putting people at risk and making them less healthy and less safe. And so I think this is a twofold conversation where we can have them independently. We can talk about decrim over here, and we actually can just fund services in the meantime. While we're having these conversations about decriminalization, we can just fund harm reduction and outreach. We can actually fund job training and housing support. We don't have to do them in the same breath, but we continue to because it's more politically solvent. But at the same time, if we're going to talk about policing and we're going to talk about services, we need to actually have a conversation about how criminalization and policing is compromising people's health.
Great. All right, Mary, do you want to talk a little bit about that as it relates to the equity model?
Yeah, I think in this area, when we talk about services, I think that if Kate were to write a policy and I were to write a policy, they would look remarkably similar. This is really where those camps, this is where we have a lot of alignment because services are just so necessary across so many different perspectives. I think what's important to note here is that full criminalization model that we have in the US is an antiquated model because it equates participation in the sex trade with being a moral failure. And if you look at a lot of the statutes that are written, they reflect that sentiment quite severely. And so equating participation in the sex trade with it being a moral failure is missing the point. The point is that the individuals who are in the sex trade, a lot of them, the majority of them are there because some vulnerability put them in a situation where they had to turn to the sex trade to survive or they were exploited in the sex trade. And so if we don't address that initial vulnerability plus whatever trauma they have faced coming out of the sex trade, they're going to loop right back in and they're going to see these incredible harms. And so those services need to be provided regardless of whether or not you have a trafficker, regardless of whether or not you're choosing to stay in the sex trade, because the violence is so prevalent. And particularly, I love what Kate said around policing. When when we police people who are being sold for sex, when that focus is on those individuals, we're focusing on their activity and not on their vulnerability, not on how can we serve you, how can we help you, reach economic stability, do we need job placement, do we need housing, what are the links to all of these things. It's the same thing with the equality model. And for example, in Sweden, where this was implemented, their Office for Violence Against Women, because their equality model is under their larger Violence Against Women Act that they implemented in 1999, 10 years into implementation, they reported a 50% decrease in trafficking because these services were being made available and because people were able to identify the trafficking situations and help those get out. And that shift in power to the person who's being sold for sex rather than the buyer, it is a real deterrence of trafficking happening in that situation. So the services that are being provided then are really important to help those individuals who are left behind when the traffickers move out to be able to exit and to be able to solidify an economic independence.
Great. So I know that, when we talk about trafficking, there's a lot of talk about women, right? We don't, though, often talk about men and non-binary individuals. We also don't talk enough about how trafficking really disproportionately impacts people of color, people from the LGBTQ community, people who have disabilities. And so I'm curious if foreign nationals who come to the United States, I'm curious if you could talk each from your perspective in terms of the policy that you think is, again, going to get us as close as possible to our goal of not having people exploited. If you can talk about how that policy specifically impacts, and I know I mentioned a bunch of different communities, so I'm not sure we can talk in depth about each of them, but just from that framework of thinking of people who are not always centered in the field, when we're, males, non-binary, LGBTQ, people of color, people with disabilities, foreign nationals. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how the various policy, especially the ones that you think will be the most helpful, will address the unique needs of these populations? And Mary, I'm going to switch it back. Do you want to go first, and then we'll go to Kate?
Sure. Actually, I'm gonna let Kate go first on this one. Let me let
Perfect.
Kate.
All right, go ahead, Kate.
Sure. So I'm gonna do the thing that no one ever does and tells you that decriminalization alone isn't the answer. Trafficking doesn't target people. Trafficking targets vulnerability. And when we're looking at all of those groups, what do those groups have in common? Those groups all face barriers to support. They all face barriers to resources, and they're not the same barriers. Someone who is undocumented faces a different kind of barrier than someone who is a queer young person and a trans young person, who faces different barriers than someone who is, disabled and they're on SSI or they're struggling to get SSI. It is different than someone who has a record, who is trying to support kids and can't get a living wage job because they can't get through an interview because they are on parole and no one wants to hire a mom on parole. But the thing that every single one of those groups has in common is that these are constructed barriers. They are social barriers that we can actually just take down. And so when we say decrim, I know there's a question somewhere in there of like, what is, the concern you have about the policy that you support? The answer is that decrim is the beginning of a conversation and not the end of a conversation. And it is a conversation on collective liberation and collective support. And it needs to be. And, someone shouldn't have to be a victim of trafficking, like I was saying before. When actually SSI that provides enough for someone to live on and raise a family on is something we could just do, when we could actually just vacate people's convictions so they're not walking around with a 15-year, 8-page long criminal record for trespassing because they were sleeping inside, shoplifting because they were hungry, and sex work because they were trying to get enough to sleep in a motel that night. We can actually do these things. And so when we're talking about, what does trafficking look like? It does not look like being kidnapped from IKEA. It looks like a trafficker saying, who is marginalized and who can I target? And especially who is criminalized and who is stigmatized and who is erased from our social collective idea of who we are enough to have nowhere to go to when they need help, and nowhere that they can trust that they won't be arrested and exploited by law enforcement, that they won't be deported themselves. And so when we're talking about criminalization, we're just talking about a very tiny piece of what is a much larger and needs to be a much larger conversation about all of those different things and about all the ways that we can actually support people. Because if we actually do that, that's not just about trafficking victims and finding the right shelter. That is not just about giving people harm reduction options so that they have to see one less client. It is about someone being able to say, I don't need this, and that situation looks shady, and I'm not reliant on that shady situation because I have enough structural and social support to make my resource needs, and I'm not desperate, and I don't have this one singular option. And so whether we're talking about these different communities, we have to talk about, you have to look at the individual barriers that every single one of those faces, finding a place for finding a shelter that is gender affirming, where you can bring your dog who you've had your entire life and is the only thing around you that you feel comfortable with, and that is, the element of safety in your life. That's really fucking hard. I know this is a CLA course and it's recorded, so I'm sorry about that. It's really, really hard. And if we can actually talk to those communities and say, what are the barriers that you're facing? How do we tailor our answers to make sure that you as an individual, with all your unique and complex ways that you are living into, your truth and who you are, if we can find an answer for those, if we can just keep doing that, that's how we need to center those groups uniquely. What we need to do ununiquely is say that every single person is entitled to that, and we can actually just create that as the wealthiest country in the world.
All right, Mary, now you're up. No, just kidding.
I wanted Kate to speak into that first, because I think that this piece of the conversation, as far as like the debate, quote unquote, between these two things, this is so much of where the contention is. And I think that both sides have a common goal of not seeing an increase in trafficking. We have a different idea of how to get there. And I didn't want it to show up like I was the anti-trafficking one and Kate wasn't. Like, Kate has a heart to make sure that trafficking does not increase. And I completely agree with everything that she said with the characterization of what happened, like how trafficking happens, because she's absolutely right. Traffickers do not target people or individuals. They target vulnerabilities. And sometimes a person looks like a vulnerability. If you have dark skin in this country, you look like a walking vulnerability to a trafficker. When we look at sort of the difference between these two, to me, this is where the defining line is where are we going to see the increase in trafficking? Where are we going to see the increase in harm? And I've researched this extensively, and I used to be of the opinion that full decriminalization or even legalization was going to be the answer. But sort of as I've done research, when we look at research, we have to look at it in its entirety, not just in the research that aligns with a particular group of people that we're looking at or something else. And so if we sort of stack the research up, because I've done this, I created different folders. Research that shows that trafficking is going to decrease in a full decriminalization, and research that shows that trafficking is going to decrease in a partial decriminalization. There's more research that shows that trafficking is going to decrease in partial decriminalization, purely because the decriminalization of demand always leads to an increase in sex trafficking. It always does. When the entirety of the sex trade is decriminalized, it's practically an open invitation for traffickers to move into that situation, because they know that they're now able to function within the sex trade with impunity. It is hard enough for us to identify trafficking that is happening in the sex trade now in the United States, because there's a whole lot of FaceTime that happens between people who are sold for sex and law enforcement. But there's not a whole lot of knowledge of how to have that dialogue and how to build that trust around, are you being trafficked? Is this a situation where you don't have choice? In a full decriminalization setting, there's very little interaction between people who are sold for sex and law enforcement. There's very little opportunity to have those conversations. And the reality is, in the United States, most people who are trafficked have no idea that they're being trafficked. They don't have that terminology. They don't have that understanding of exploitation, because they come from communities where this is normalized. They come from communities where their mom was trafficked by their dad was their mom's pimp, etc. So in the US, when we look at our context, when we look at the relationship to chattel slavery, when we look at the way that slavery has existed in the United States on this continent for hundreds of years, and it has simply morphed, is that if we decriminalize, we are going to see a huge increase in trafficking. It's been predicted in the context of the United States, but we also see that in other countries where demand has been decriminalized.
Great. We have 5 more minutes before we open it up for questions. And I know that one of the things that we all talked about kind of as we pre-gamed this was the importance of the unspoken labor trafficking, right? And so while I think today's discussion is focused on sex trafficking, I do want to both, highlight the importance of labor trafficking. And Sheila mentioned there is another episode, another session happening on labor trafficking. But what, from your perspective, what would you like to know, the audience to understand about how there's an intertwine between labor rights and labor trafficking? And what would you like them to take away, either as it relates to this discussion or separately? All right. Mary, do you want to go first? I feel like I'm choosing, right? Eeny, meeny, as my kid would say. Mary, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure. Yeah. So as we look at the relationship between labor trafficking and sex trafficking, there is some overlap. Some people are trafficked in the sex trade, and some people also experience labor trafficking. So the line isn't always clear. The line can often be blurred in people's experiences. And of course, we never want to dictate someone's experience. We want everyone, any individual that we work with, we want them to fully own their experience and their interpretation of what happened. But we know that a lot of people, there's like that blur between the two. So the decriminalization of people who are sold for sex opens the door for us to offer a whole lot more services that are also going to be very, very applicable to people who are experiencing labor trafficking. The interesting sort of difference between sex trafficking and labor trafficking is that prostitution is the mechanism by which people are trafficked in the sex trade. Anyone who experiences sex trafficking is trafficked into the sex trade, which has this criminalization element to it. Labor trafficking, that's not necessarily the case. Labor trafficking has a whole lot more nuance to it, and it's far more difficult to figure out what's going on in there because there is no criminalization element of a lot of the industries in which they are trafficked. When we're looking at agriculture, and we're looking at construction, etc. So I think that that's actually a really good comparison to see, okay, if there is no, if there is no checks and balance on the system, if there is no criminalization element, like what we're talking about in partial decrim, it's going to look like the way that we treat labor trafficking in the US, which is it is so hidden. There's very few mechanisms by which we can successfully identify labor trafficking. It's way easier to hide it when it exists in industries that are legalized or are fully decriminalized or are regulated or whatever that is outside of the sex trade.
Kate, you want to share kind of as it relates to labor trafficking a little bit?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, sex workers work, and so all of it is labor trafficking. And yes, there is a delineation for criminalization, but I would say for folks that really want to look at the reason why one is called labor trafficking and one is called sex trafficking, that's a really important history, because it was a really intentional decision that wasn't related to the informality. It wasn't related to the criminalization of the industry. It was related to advocates that wanted to hyper criminalize the sex industry and make that delineation. It was one that was decided by a lot of people who are not sex workers. I would say that, when it comes to the policing, the difference, there are a number of different criminalized industries where trafficking happens. And it remains really hidden. I would say the difference between, why we're talking about labor trafficking over here and why we're talking about sex trafficking and why the rates are so different is the way that we look at policing and the way that we look at training. I mean, the fact that we are still doing labor trafficking 101s while, Law and Order has been doing sex trafficking 101s for the last 15 years is really based on how we've approached these two issues and not necessarily prevalence, and definitely not how we understand them as being important to the conversation of trafficking. If we're looking at, here's a funding mechanism to investigate trafficking. And by the way, who we're funding is your local vice squad and not your local wage and hour investigator. That's going to tell you who they're going to find. The local vice squad here doesn't have the budget to go out and investigate. I'm based in Baltimore. They're not going out and investigating the farms that are in upstate Maryland, and they're definitely not on the Eastern Shore talking to the people who are on temporary visas working seasonally for below minimum wage. They're doing vice stings, and now they have the trafficking grant, and so that's who they're going to find. And so, I would say when we're talking about labor rights and labor trafficking, it's a really important conversation, and it really needs to be a lot more centralized for the fact that, we're not investigating and we're not looking and we don't have an eye on it. And we lump it all under labor trafficking and use the same techniques of like, well, maybe if we do a raid and do checks on who's documented and who's not documented, maybe that'll give us something, because that's what a lot of this is, a lot of how labor trafficking investigations are happening, unfortunately. I would say the other really important connection is the vast majority of people that I have worked with come from bad labor situations before they went to the sex industry, and they don't leave the sex industry because only bad labor situations are being offered to them. Look, no one here has to, I'm not saying you should feel any type of way about the sex industry. No one needs to change how they feel about it. If you think the sex industry is the worst thing in the world, then the best thing that you can do is create other options for people. We might disagree on the numbers of how many people would say they're in by choice, by circumstance. But when we're talking about the vast majority of people, sure, if you present a better option that makes the same amount of money, that has a flexibility of schedule, if you are disabled, you can take off 2 weeks because your body can't take it anymore. Like, how many jobs have that? How many jobs let you raise kids? How many jobs let you have a chronic fatigue illness? How many jobs are accessible and pay enough to where you are economically solvent, especially if you have, challenges accessing formal education already, if you have housing instability already. So, if let's say that ending the sex industry is the most important thing in the world, then what you need to do is create a lot of other options for people who are facing a lot of other barriers. And that comes down to, how do we talk about labor rights, and how do we talk about labor rights for marginalized people who are facing circumstances that mean that the sex industry is the only viable option? Because that shouldn't be true either. As long as I've worked in the sex industry, no one should feel that only one form of physical and intimate labor is the only way to be economically solvent. That's just true across the board. And so I think the conversation when we talk about this is that, ending trafficking is about raising the floor for everyone, and it's not about cherry picking out victims. And when we talk about labor rights, and when we talk about, a universal basic income, that becomes the center of a much more important, much more effective, and much more widespread answer for how we address trafficking in literally every single industry, criminalized, informal, or whatever.
So we are now kind of at our Q&A section, but in kind of the spirit of dialogue, before we have a number of questions that have come in through the panelists, but in the spirit of dialogue, before we kind of start with them, I'm wondering, do either of you have any questions for each other based on kind of what's been shared today, or just, just kind of your understanding of the field? And no pressure if you don't, because we have plenty of questions in the dialogue. All right, I'm going to let you guys think about it. You guys can think about it. I'll start with the first question, but know that you guys can ask questions too. So the first question that we have is, which I do think, a lot of people have this question, is all sex workers at some point or another will have their boundaries pushed. They'll be forced to do something, stripping, et cetera, something that they won't. And there's a gray area of whether or not they have truly consented. So given that reality, which I think, again, is an area where we agree, right, where there's widespread agreement, how would you respond to that concern around the model and what we should be pushing in terms of policy-wise?
Yeah, I think that is a huge reason why we need to decriminalize people who are sold for sex, or for people who trade sex. I've worked with women who they didn't identify their situation as trafficking for 18 months to 2 years after they exited the sex trade. Part of the reason why the federal statute dictates that force, fraud, or coercion are the mechanisms of trafficking is that coercion element is so important. That's where the gray area is was I manipulated to do this? Was this actually my choice? Is this psychological coercion? And it is that element around coercion that led to the federal statute being written, the TVPA. This is why we needed the TVPA in addition to the 13th Amendment, is the act of using coercion to force someone to do something that they have not chosen to do. So I think that really is the argument around decriminalizing people sold for sex.
Anything to add, Kate?
Yeah, I think decriminalization, definitely making options available for folks where they're not afraid of being arrested. I think the other thing is that the idea that justice and the response needs to come in the form of law enforcement is not a natural idea, it's a naturalized idea. And so I think the other thing that we need to do is really better understand what people want in those situations. Because some people will have that situation and what they want is better working conditions after. Some people don't want to work anymore after. Some people say, this is, I come from spaces where I experience this and this is something that I deal with, and what I want is it to stop happening. Some people want that person to be punished, and all of those things are completely valid options, and not wanting those things are completely valid answers as well. And so I think when we're talking about those situations, the next question is not what do we do? The next question is, what does that person want? And I think for a lot of folks, having an option that isn't law enforcement, having an option that is much more about healing and centering that healing first is, I think, the other piece of what needs to happen is just far more options for people, because one of the things that we really haven't talked about and is very present under criminalization is that we've all worked with a lot of people who have had harmful encounters, and a lot of those harmful encounters have been perpetuated by law enforcement themselves, and under criminalization, but also under most models, that is not dealt with until we really start talking about what justice and what healing is outside of being predicated on really criminal intervention.
Great. I think this next question is just for Mary. It says, is the assumption behind the end demand or equity or equality model that buying sexual service is inherently harmful even when the transaction is mutually consensual?
Some people would argue yes. Others would argue no. Like Erin said, I'm not here to represent the whole. As far as consent goes, if both parties are truly consenting, and when money is involved, consent can be tricky. That's not particularly my concern. It's what happens on the mass scale when demand is decriminalized. I think that when we're looking at policy, and this is true of, any policy that we look at what happened with healthcare, we look at what happens with education, we're looking to do the least amount of harm and the most amount of good. And so that's the biggest reason why I'm supporting the equality models, because when we look at it on scale, I think that compared to the other models, it does do that. It does the least amount of harm and the most amount of good.
Great. Yeah. And I would just echo what Mary said, which is there are people who believe that. And that is why this is so complex. This is not just black and white. There is a lot of shades of gray to this conversation, because there are people who have a wide variety of opinions and perspectives, even within the different camps. And it's oftentimes not, you can't just kind of say, oh, well, if you think this, there's a doctrine you have to sign where you agree and check off and, place your initials that you agree to all of these points. That's just not how this works. It's not how most things work, right? So there are some questions about male victims in particular. And I'm not sure that these have to do with kind of our general discussion, but I do think it's important to talk about males, as we do so little in our field. In regards to services, do you think the lack of resources for male victims of trafficking has the potential to exacerbate this issue? Go ahead, Kate.
Yes. And I think that I really appreciate that question being asked, because, when we talk about trafficking, how often do we talk about it as gender-based violence? How often do we talk about these very, very specific ideas of who is selling sex, who is buying sex, and who is a third party, and who is a manager, because that is also a very gendered story. And I think one of the reasons why it's so important to talk about labor, to talk about the different dynamics of, who is facing exploitation and who is left out of those conversations, is because, we, as professionals, we can talk to each other, but there is a broader dialogue that is a very gendered dialogue and is a very specific story. And what that means is that not only are less resources allocated, there's a lot of trafficking shelters which are gender specific shelters, and under the Trump administration were allowed to exclude also non-binary and trans women. When they're and these policies get formed and resources get allocated in a way that reflects very often this narrative of trafficking that we have. But that also affects who gets arrested, who gets charged with what. When you go to the judge, that judge has ingested that story. When you go to do voir dire and jury selection, those jurors have invested in that story. When you go to, who's reading an affidavit, who is processing a trafficking visa, they've all read this story. And so not only does the lack of conversation and the lack of acknowledgement that exploitation does happen to workers across the gender spectrum, that has ramifications at every single level that just re-marginalizes people who don't fit into the narrative of who we think is a victim and who we think is a perpetrator. And so thank you for that question and making sure that we do acknowledge the very serious ramifications of leaving male survivors of exploitation out of these conversations.
Mary, do you want to add?
Yeah, I 100% agree. And, I'm out here in Boston, and WGBH just did a fantastic series on the unseen victim of sex trafficking, which are men and boys. So I highly encourage anyone to go look at that. That reporting is fantastic. When we look at men and boys who are trafficked in the commercial sex trade, there's a huge overlap with the LGBTQ community, sort of what Kate touched on. And so for, specifically for individuals who are transitioning or in transition, it's like, oh, do I qualify for services, and where do I go, and what do I do? And because the exit services or aftercare services or whatever you want to call them are so hyper focused on women, there's very few services for men and boys. I am often in the situation of not even being able to provide a referral necessarily of a type of service that someone is looking for because it does not exist, which is just so sad. And that, that also discrimination of men and boys, particularly who identify in the LGBTQ plus arena, that then leads to this argument of, we should legalize the sex trade because this is the only viable option that they have for economic stability, because they're discriminated against in other areas of the workforce, which I think is so sad, and that seriously breaks my heart. Because I think that it is absolutely wrong for us to say this is the best that we can do for these individuals, because it is not. These individuals absolutely should be fully invited to participate in society. And that means that we in this space need to be talking to other people about equity. We need to be talking about services for men and boys. We need to be talking about the inclusion of the LGBTQ plus community in all sorts of different policies, really considering them.
And there's another question about kind of a specific vulnerable population, which is, in the US, as we've said, both people who are US citizens and non-US citizens can be trafficked under our statutes. But their question is, how do you believe that changing the decriminalization status, either partial or full, could impact non-US citizens specifically? So I don't know if you've given any thought about how would this specifically impact non-US citizens? Oh, I'm supposed to call. Kate, go ahead. You look like you're.
Sure.
Next one's you.
So I will say that criminalization in the United States happens on multiple levels. Predominantly, it is state-based laws that criminalize the sex industry in every single state. Some have municipalities that double down on some of these, especially things like zoning laws and loitering laws are often at the municipal level. And at the federal level, one of the places where it is criminalized is in immigration law. So that is one of the other areas that if we decriminalize on the state law, right now, an arrest for prostitution is considered a crime of moral turpitude, which can get you deported. It can, for victims of trafficking or people who want to switch their status to become U.S. citizens for legal permanent residency, they have trouble doing that. So, there are, I know that this is a legal panel, so there are a number of different very specific legal ramifications for people who have prostitution arrests on their records. And there is in INS specifically an entire section that is about prostitution. If we look actually at the history of our immigration law, it has since the beginning, literally since 1875, said that people who are sex workers are not welcome in this country. It has been very explicit, and it has been incredibly racialized, because what I'm referring to was 100% about Asian sex workers. And that idea of hyperfeminization, and especially a hypersexualization of Asian women, of women of color in different ways, has permeated the criminalization of people who trade sex throughout the history of the United States. And so that is one very significant part of this conversation. Beyond that, and when we're looking at really the day-to-day lives of migrant sex workers in this country, that is another population that is hyper visibilized and also hyper silenced. It pieces together so many conversations of xenophobia, of what it means when especially women of color come to this country, and what it means for them to have free access to capital. That is the fear that undergirds so much of these laws and of these prosecutions of migrant sex workers. And so when we're talking about this, we're really talking about a population who lives at every level of fear and criminalization, and therefore every level of marginalization. Because when migrant sex workers are arrested, you're not just looking at the trauma of arrest, you are now looking at asset seizure, where they will take all the money that you have on you. And migrant sex workers very often are carrying more cash because they're not looking to stay in this country long term necessarily, or have less options for where to put that money, and how to put it in bank accounts, how to move money around. And so you're looking at asset seizure. You're then looking at a possible referral to deportation proceedings. And very often that means everyone around you is also criminalized. And so when we're talking about this nexus, we're really talking about several overlays of criminalization, and one that is often not talked about and not alleviated when we talk about decriminalization, not being caught up in a raid. Yes, that might mean you might not be deported, but that doesn't alleviate the fact that if you are out of status, or if you are on a different kind of visa, you probably will not be allowed to participate in the sex trade, and the ramifications are very, very serious. Recently, there has been this spate of this idea that we need to talk about, and when we say talk about, that leads to we need to raid massage parlors. It has absolutely caused incredible ramifications for migrant sex workers in this country, but also, as we've seen, that narrative, that hypersexualization of especially Asian women, has led to violence, has led to incredible forms of harm, as we saw what happened in Atlanta. We can't divorce the way that we call people victims, the way that we call people, the way that we also have these stories of xenophobia, how we have these narratives of xenophobia, and how all of this is really about an invitation for, then we need to raid, we need to arrest, because at the very least, maybe we'll find a trafficking victim. And that's not what happens when we do these things. When we have these narratives that are demanding interventions that people do not consent to, what we're ultimately doing is really causing very serious long-term harm and re-marginalizing some of the most marginalized sex workers and some of the most marginalized migrant workers.
Mary, do you want to speak to it?
I think Kate covered, I covered that so well. I would just add that it also forces on a narrative to these individuals, and really puts them in a corner of basically needing to define themselves as a trafficking victim, and then therefore labeled as that in order to access services, in order to get a visa, in order to, do all of these situations, which we would not, in the service, as far as, service providers go, we would never do that to a US citizen. We would never say, oh, well, you have to claim to have been trafficked in order to do X, Y, Z. So there's a huge limitation on then how we're able to help them, on how they're able to, start a healing journey if they have been traumatized, if that is their narrative, and the way that they're able to interact with their communities and the way that they're able to get help.
I know that we are focused on adults in this conversation, and that is the focus. Although there is a question that I'm going to ask because I know it comes up a lot, which is, what is the impact of changing these laws as they relate to adults? What impact will it have potentially for minors? And I believe how it's worded, it says, I believe this becomes more dangerous for minors. Is there any data on this? Specifically, I believe that what I have at least heard in the field is that narrative of, as you have increased demand, you need an increased supply and therefore children. And so can you speak at all to that narrative and kind of how the model that you've talked about you believe will impact minors in general? And so Mary, I'm going to start with you because we've started with Kate on the last two.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. When we have an increase in demand, we need an increase in supply. And traffickers traffickers want to go to the easiest thing possible. And this is why we see a lot of children who have been involved in the foster care system who end up being trafficked. The average age of entry into the sex trade in the United States is between 14 and 17 years old. And there are quite a few people who enter the sex trade under the age of 14. So really, most people who are trafficked in the sex trade and enter the sex trade are entering as children. But as soon as you turn 18, you're automatically considered an adult. And all of the services that were available to you when you were under the age of 18 go away. And so that's a huge problem. The other issue that we see a lot is traffickers basically ingrain and train children that they're being trafficked with the answers that they're supposed to provide if they ever interact with law enforcement. And a huge portion of that is to fake being an adult. And so we have a lot of kids who are charged as adults while they are being trafficked, but they're charged as adults for prostitution and other crimes related to it. So the equality model really is an answer to a lot of those issues. Because when we do continue to criminalize demand, we don't see that huge spike in demand, and therefore there's not this need for a huge spike in supply. It protects a lot of those kids. But also we're not automatically criminalizing people as soon as they turn 18 years old and then have this need to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to access a lot of government funded services. There's a lot of government funded services that are restricted to trafficking victims. And so we have to, for some of us program service providers, we have to be careful about which programs get government funding and which don't, because we don't want to be restricted to offering services to someone who has proven that they have a trafficker, or said that they have a trafficker, because the situation is just way more complicated than that.
Kate, you want to talk a little bit about minors and potential impact?
So I think, first and foremost, I think this is one area that Mary and I really disagree on, that changing the criminal regime has a significant impact on the size of the market. Of the countries that have changed since 1999, not a single one has been able to connect the changing of a criminal regime with a significant change in the size of the market, either up or down. And that includes New Zealand. When they decriminalized, actually there was a slight reduction in the size of the market. When other countries have moved from different forms of criminalization to asymmetrical criminalization, there haven't been any other changes in the market. And so what we know is that the size of the market is not actually governed or not significantly impacted by the legal regime that is being implemented. It means that there's other factors that are causing people to sell sex. And, if that were true, then full criminalization would mean the decimation of the sex industry. And we definitely know that's not true. And then if we look at, every single state in the country has a slightly different rate of prostitution arrests and the size of the market. We know that it goes from Nevada. It has the absolute highest number of prostitution arrests. And we know that that is not prostitution buyer and seller. And we know that that doesn't have an impact on the market. If decriminalization or not prosecuting for criminal charges would have a significant impact on the size of the sex industry, then Wyoming and Vermont arrest like 1 or 2 people a year, and that's not the epicenter of the sex trade, and people aren't flocking to the sex trade or to Wyoming to participate in the sex industry. There's just a lot of other facets that change the size of the market. And so I just disagree that it would cause people who are looking to traffic another individual into the sex industry to do that, because those aren't the push and pull factors that govern trafficking. So when we're talking about, decriminalization and the impact on youth, I wish I could tell you something definitive. There's one country which has moved from a criminalization structure to a decriminalization structure, and that was New Zealand. And when they passed that law, they actually created a penalty for patronizing of minors, and they created a penalty for hiring minors to work in the sex industry. And so we don't really have a lot of information about that very specific thing. But what we do know is that those other factors are just so much more important. When I was in New York, I was working with one youth service agency that said, oh, we had a huge spike in the number of the kids that we saw who were participating in the sex industry. And, what was the predicating factor? Well, they had just changed access to SNAP benefits. They had just changed it to create a lot more barriers to accessing food stamps for young people. And young people were saying, you know what, I keep getting kicked off, or I keep getting denied, and therefore it's just easier for me to trade sex. And that shouldn't be the case. I think everyone agrees that that should never be the case. And so when we're talking about young people, you're talking about people who are already classified as trafficking victims. When they participate in the sex industry. And what we know is that the factors that lead them to do that are really basic access to resources. And so if we want to, make sure that young people are not utilizing the sex industry and are not drawn to the sex industry, we have to make sure that all of their other needs are met, so that that is never something that crosses their mind as a need. And honestly, that should be low-hanging fruit. We should be able to walk into a policymaker and say, we have homeless young people and they should hand us a blank check. And we know that that's the determining factor. And the other thing is, and I know everyone's heard me talk about it. Everyone who knows me knows that I talk about this. If you do not participate in the sex industry and you are being exploited as a young person, it is probably in informal labor. It is probably in an unregulated industry, and it is almost impossible to get services and certified as a victim of trafficking. And so no one should say, I need services, therefore am I a victim of trafficking, especially people under the age of 18. You should just be able to walk in and walk out with a bed to sleep in, enough food, and enough support to go to school and to not have to work at all.
Great. So first of all, we are not going to get to all of these questions. We have lots of questions coming in, so we're doing our best, but we have committed to ending around 8 o'clock. One of the things people are asking is that there's been a lot of different stats, and people are asking for sources of various stats and various studies. I don't know that we are going to be able to respond where each of these studies came from, but generally speaking, where I know we put a bunch of resources on the website, where else are good places for people to get some of the stats that have been cited or that you guys have talked about? Or if they want more information, kind of where are good places too?
Yeah, we have a web page on our site, amirainc.org, where we have listed our position and then a lot of statistics related to that. I saw a question specifically on the 87 to 89% stat that I referenced. Those are from particularly 2 studies by Melissa Farley that you can look up if you have access to like JSTOR or something like that. So I would go to those places. World Without Exploitation has a fantastic webpage with statistics as well. And then there's several other, Polaris has an amazing, they run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They have an amazing list of resources and have published a lot of their findings since they launched the National Human Trafficking Hotline in 2007.
Okay.
And yeah, one of the links on the page that advertises this, I pulled together a white paper basically that it looks at every single country. Of the 7 countries that have changed, 5 of them have of the 7 countries that have adopted asymmetrical criminalization, 1 never funded that and so never implemented the law. 1, Israel, has changed over to recently and there's no studies. Every other study has reports from government agencies and service bodies that ask what happens to people who trade sex under this law before and after. And so all of those studies, literally every single one that I could find from governments or otherwise, is referenced in there. Please go read it. Please go critique it. Send me angry emails if you want. But every single one is linked. And when it comes to decriminalization, there are some studies out there, but honestly, if you want to really dig in, it's 1 country, it's New Zealand, and 5 years, so 2008, their Department of Justice released a very, very well documented report on what happened 5 years after decriminalization, and is available on the New Zealand government website.
Great. So as we come towards the end of the discussion, what would each of you like the audience to walk away with in terms of their understanding for today? If you had your magic wand and you said, all right, of all the people who attended, I hope that they walk away really understanding this, what would it be? Okay, Kate, do you want to go first on this one? Or yeah, and then Mary, I'll have you go first on the next one.
I think from anything, just because decriminalization of the sex industry takes all the air out of the room doesn't mean it's the only conversation. There are so many other things that need to get talked about, and there are so many other things that sex workers want and need. That's across the spectrum of experience. And that's true in both sides. I feel like in trafficking spaces, decriminalizing the sex industry takes all this space and time and means we don't get to talk about these other things. And in sex work spaces, people end up spending a ton of time talking about trafficking, where if you're talking about all the things that sex workers need and all the forms of violence and harm that sex workers face, trafficking is not number one on the list. And so why do we spend every second of this conversation focused on one law that is not going to be the silver bullet for any of these answers of how do sex workers there is no one thing that's going to improve the health and wellness of sex workers, and there's not one thing that's going to end trafficking, and it's definitely not this singular law. And as someone who works on decriminalization in multiple states, there's not a single group that I work with where this is the only thing that people talk about. There's not a single group where this is the only form of harm that people are reporting. It's not the one thing. And so I think as much as we've spent, we're about to spend 2 hours talking about this issue, I wish to God I could talk about way, way, way more things.
Mary?
Yeah, I think what I would want people to walk away from is understanding that the issue is way more complex than who's right and who's wrong. Which camp has it and which camp doesn't. Like we talked about, it's really a spectrum, and policy is all about how you write it, where you get your funding from, and how you implement it. You can have a perfect policy written, and if the way you implement it is not good, it ultimately fails. And so ultimately, when we approach these conversations, I think it's really important that we approach them with compassion, that we approach them for compassion with each other. That I have compassion for Kate's perspective, Kate has compassion for my perspective, and particularly that we're hyper-focused on the people who this is actually going to impact. I am not in the sex trade. This is not going to directly impact me. This is going to impact others who are in the sex trade. And that's where the focus really needs to be. And so I think in that spirit of compassion, we need to look at collaboration, because I think that both Kate and I have made excellent points and really important points about how each of our policies could potentially cause harm or potentially cause good, depending on the way that it's written. And, iron sharpens iron. We need those perspectives. We need to have those conversations. I think that disagreement refines policy more than it implodes policy. But collaboration is necessary to have those conversations, to really form, policy that is actually going to be impactful, that incorporates all of these different perspectives, all of the research, all of the different sides. So I think that's what I would want people to walk away from.
And you kind of touched on it, but I'm going to ask it in a more direct way, which is, at the start of this discussion, we talked about how this conversation can be really difficult. And as Sheila noted, when she talked about doing this conversation about a year ago or so, I was one of the people that was like, oh, please don't, please, let's not do this. Right. I was so we don't need another one of these things. And it is really hard. Right. And first of all, I just want to say how much I appreciate that both of you are willing to do this, right? It was different, right? This doesn't often happen in our field. We don't oftentimes have civil conversations where we're really trying to come together and talk with each other and provide information and not be adversarial about it, and acknowledge where there is, mutual respect and mutual agreement in areas that we could collaborate on. And so, I do think it's the hope of me, I know at Love 146 that we can do more of this as a field. I think there's a recognition that the field in some areas has stagnated just because of the infighting that exists, and because we can't come around the table and engage in collaborative discussion that is respectful. And so I am curious to hear from both of you. Why do you think it's important to engage in these type of conversations? And also, what do you need from the field and from people in order to feel safe doing so? All right, Mary, how about you start with this one?
When I think about with this question, I think about what we're seeing a lot in not just our society, but societies across the world today, which is polarization. It's this dissecting into camps and, saying I'm over here and you're over there, and we don't talk, we don't touch. And I think that polarization can lead to dehumanization and misunderstanding of each other, misunderstanding of goals. I appreciated coming to this conversation. When Kate and I talked ahead of time with the rest of the people who are involved in putting this event on, we really just came to an agreement of these are our goals. We have a disagreement in some ways of how to get there, but in 80% of those ways, we really agree. And that's, I think, where the conversation gets exciting. That's, I think, where we have so much potential. Is when we come to these conversations as well with humility, to understand that policy, until it's written and implemented, it's all theoretical, and it's all contextual. And so when we come to these conversations with humility, we're able to really listen to the person across the table and really hear that perspective and incorporate that perspective, and show that compassion and show that care. I think ultimately we need to remember that each of us are human, and we have the ability to hurt each other, and we have the ability to help each other. And when we focus on helping each other more than hurting each other, we don't just, work within this space, but that then becomes a model of how are we going to change society and change the way that people look at the sex trade, change the way that people look at people who trade sex, change the way that we look at trafficking. That starts with us.
Love it. All right, Kate, how about you?
Yeah, I really second everything that Mary said. We came into this with a shared goal and with a lot of shared values. And yeah, it is a really hard conversation. It's a really difficult conversation. And, for the nitty gritty, we spent time talking about what felt comfortable, and all of us sitting around with a shared understanding of what we wanted to do. And none of it was win. It was about understanding the ways that we overlap and recognizing the places that we don't overlap, and also recognizing that just because I believe in decriminalization, there's a lot of people that believe in decriminalization that do not agree with a lot of the things that I do and I want, and no one is going to have those exact same lockstep pieces. And so we respect each other in terms of wanting to get to the next shared step, and recognizing that if we do that with values, and if we do that with integrity, if we do that with transparency, then we'll get to the next step. And we have to be really transparent about what we need to show up to these spaces in the meantime, and be respectful of other people's needs and other people's boundaries. And that's the only way that we can move forward on this. They're hard conversations to have, and they're painful conversations to have. And especially, the more we do need to bring in people with more lived experience. And we also need to recognize that we are not entitled to their trauma, and we don't need people to purge themselves of that to be relevant to this conversation. I can simply show up and say, I respect what you do. If someone comes to me and is like, I'm thinking about leaving the sex industry, I now know another place that I can send them. And that is a shared investment in our communities collectively. And, you know, as long as we can keep having those conversations in a way that says, like, you believe what you believe, and it is deeply held, and I believe that you know, have goodwill and integrity and came to it through a righteous and values-based process, then why would I ever exclude you or want to, you know, cause harm or damage in those conversations? All I want to do is share space with you and find the places that we do align. And maybe when we do come to those hard conversations, at least we'll have a relationship that's based on trust behind us, where I can ask you questions, and sometimes hard questions, and you can do the same to me. And as long as that is our focus, as long as that is our rubric, as long as those are our value structures, and we know that at the end of the day, no one should ever have to trade sex or, you know, pick radishes or be a domestic worker against their will, and no one should only ever have one option. Like, we all believe that together. And if that really is the thing that we all want sitting at that table, and we can just ask each other, what do you need to show up, and how do I make sure that I'm treating you with respect this whole time? That's the only way we can have these conversations. And the longer that we don't have them, the people who don't want to fund services, and the people who want to, you know, make sure that they don't have to think about budget reconciliation, that's who wins when we can't talk to each other. And, you know, and that means that all of us lose.
Well, thank you both again. Sheila, I am going to turn it back to you with the utmost respect for the two women who have come here today and embarked on what is a challenging conversation, but I think with grace and courage and yeah, just amazing, amazing individuals. So Sheila, do you want to close us out?
Thank you, ladies, so much. I am just so grateful, and it was just an honor to hear from you. And I just wish this conversation would go on forever. I feel like when Kate came here 2 years ago, I knew that was just the beginning. And now that I've heard you all speak, I hope that it's just the beginning of ongoing conversations that we can have about how we can improve things in our state and across the country for all sorts of people in the sex trade. And I just wanted to ask you all, we'd love to see you at later events. But again, hopefully we'll have some reprise with respect to this issue in future months. I don't see an end to Understanding Human Trafficking, the series, because I think we can go on until we see major efforts at decrim in the states. We'd love to see you Wednesday, but hopefully we'll see you at a future event. Spread the word. And again, thank you. This was like an inspiring conversation. I got goosebumps. I was like shouting at one point. I was laughing when Kate cursed. But really what I'm struck by is your bravery and just how committed you are to this issue. And, you know, so I feel like at this moment we can achieve anything with people like you at the forefront. So thank you. And thanks to the audience, to the CBF, the Connecticut Bar Foundation, the CBA, and the students, HTPP, Catherine Lima as well. Hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Thank you all.